It's National Signing Day. Texas A&M has put together a historic class, but apparently some of its SEC rivals aren't too happy about that. We'll talk about it all next, right here on SEC Country Live. Hello, everybody. Welcome into SEC Country Live. I'm Brandon Adams. Happy to have you with us here today. It is National Signing Day. At least the second part of that. Obviously, so much of what happens in the recruiting world now is front-loaded towards December, but the final time for players to be added into the current recruiting cycle happens in this traditional date in February, and in the midst of all of this, Texas A&M on its way to putting together a historic class, possibly, arguably, the greatest class of all time. More on that in a moment. First, though, the reaction. So much, and we actually addressed this a good bit last week on SEC Country Live, so much of the chatter related to this number one class that Texas A&M has put together here this year has centered around what role name, image, likeness revenue payments have played in making all this happen. There have been wild rumors thrown out there, much of that unsubstantiated. In some cases, some of that even outright refuted, like Texas A&M Athletic Director Ross Bjork, which we told you about last week. However, that has not stopped others around the sport from assuming that NIL money is playing an unfair role in how certain recruits are making their college choice here right now. In fact, I want to show you this quote from Alabama coach Nick Saban, pretty volatile at the pages of ESPN.com in the last 24 hours about his concern about what he sees happening around the sport and Saban's belief that it's way different than what was going on when he first started trying to build his program there at Alabama. Let me show you this via ESPN, the quote from Nick Saban, who says, "When we start using name, image, and likeness for a kid to come to our school, that's where I draw the line," Saban says, because that's not why we did this. I hear these crazy people on TV who say, now you're doing it above board. He means paying players now compared to how it would have been done in the past. But Saban says to ESPN, we never did it. We never did it. We never cheated to get a player. We never paid players to come to our school. And now that's actually happening. People are making deals with high school players to go to their school. That is Nick Saban from ESPN.com. I'll read this to you. He says, this is the same Saban quote from the same story, just doesn't fit on the screen. He says, it's not about coaching and developing as much as it is what kind of money can you make. He says it's great that players have the freedom to do what they can do, but I also don't think we should create circumstances where they don't have to make the commitment and see things through. He essentially says that whoever has the most money is going to attract and acquire the most good players. Now, admittedly, there's a little bit of, I think, hypocrisy in some of what Saban says here, because while he's kind of crying poor about not being able to keep up with certain schools with name, image, likeness, doesn't mention A&M by name, but that's obviously the assumption that's made here. While he cries poor about this, you'll remember it was around this time a year ago that Saban was in Texas speaking at one of those rubber chicken circuit type deals and was bragging on the way in which his own program had helped secure what he described as a 7-figure NIL sum for his quarterback Bryce Young. So how have we gone from a year ago to Alabama's got the resources to get Bryce Young $1 million payment, but now doesn't have the resources to get anybody else any kind of payments whatsoever, at least in comparison to what they're getting other places? There is part of this, in other words, that comes across as a little bit self-serving of, well, Saban was bragging about NIL not all that long ago. Now all of a sudden he thinks it's the worst thing in the world. But for what it's worth, he is not the only one talking this way. Much the same way that Nick Saban sounds the alarm here on the reason why recruits are currently choosing the schools they're choosing. Another coach, Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, who's admittedly not as successful in a recruiting standpoint, but certainly quite successful at articulating the point he wants to get across, said the same thing this week. Ole Miss identified and introduced a handful of transfers to the program there, among them Jackson Dart, quarterback formerly of USC, and Zach Evans, running back of the former five-star variety coming out of high school, most recently of TCU. When all these transfers to the program were introduced, Lane Kiffin also spoke to the media, and when the issue of recruiting came up, Kiffin kind of just shrugs the whole thing off and saying, much the same way that Nick Saban says there, that money is the driving force behind all of this right now. Let me let you hear Lane Kiffin as a way of accentuating what Nick Saban just said a moment ago.
We don't have the same, funding resources as some of these schools do, for these NIL deals, and so it's basically dealing with different salary caps. We now have a sport that has completely different salary caps, and some of these schools are, whatever, 5-10 times more than everybody else of what they can pay the players. So I know nobody uses those phrases, but that is what it is. So I joked the other day, I didn't know if Texas A&M was going to incur a luxury tax, and how much they paid for their signing class. In free agency in the NFL, players usually go to the most money. Every once in a while they don't because they already have a bunch of money. Well, these kids are 17, 18 years old. They're going to go to where they're paid the most. So I'm not complaining. It just is what it is. Whenever there's things created, there's a lot of times problems people didn't think about, and so you just legalize paying players what people used to cheat.
There are some people who will hear what Kiffin says there, what Saban said a moment ago, and say, why is it a problem at all that players are getting paid? There are plenty of people who've argued for these kinds of benefits for players for quite some time, given the fact that coaches get so rich coaching the sport. Why not let the players enjoy some of that there as well? So to be fair, that is a retort that many will have to what Kiffin and Saban said with the comments they made a moment ago. And that said, I also don't feel like that everything that Kiffin and Saban say, and the comment that I read from Saban, the clip that I played for you from Lane Kiffin, I don't believe that all of what they say is wrong. Some of the concerns they raise about the influence of NIL on the sport, I do think are certainly worth considering here. I do think we have to, those of us who care about the sport, whether it be fan, media, coach, whatever, those of us who care about this sport, consider ourselves stakeholders in the sport, we do have to think about what we want the sport to look like going forward. I think that's probably true. However, there is something about what Lane Kiffin says in that clip, and even some about the quote that I read from Saban, that almost comes across as excuse-making a bit, that Lane Kiffin does get trounced in the recruiting trail. Now, he's pretty successful when it comes to the transfer market, but on the recruiting trail, he does get trounced. And admittedly, Ole Miss, as a program, is of a smaller stature than Texas A&M. When Texas, Oklahoma, when those programs are coming to the SEC, when Texas A&M, back in 2012, came into the SEC, it's easily understood this is a problem for some of those SEC West schools who have been a part of this division and have done what they can to fight and keep pace, but the more moneyed, resourced programs like Texas and Texas A&M just have more at their disposal than what schools like Ole Miss and Mississippi State are going to be able to have. So from that standpoint, Kiffin's not wrong. However, it's not exactly the most inspiring form of leadership on the heels of being out-recruited just to sort of shrug it off and say, oh, we can't afford to pay players, therefore we can't get anyone. That's a little bit of a weak message, I believe, from Kiffin. It's the kind of thing that I don't think sits well, certainly with his own bosses or potential employers at other programs. And to the degree to which the questions about NIL veer in the direction of just excuse-making for why you got out-recruited by Texas A&M, I find that to be a little bit problematic. And for what it's worth, and you know this because we played this clip for you before, that while A&M administration is denying some of the charges that are out there against them by how much money they've paid recruits and what role that played in swaying those recruits in that direction, Jimbo Fisher back in December certainly did not deny they're going to try to use every resource at their disposal to get the best players they can in College Station, including apparently NIL as well. This was Jimbo Fisher from back in December.
You can't promise things. You can't say, I'm going to get you an NIL deal, and that's illegal. I mean, all you can do is present what other players in your university have done in the past. That is all you're allowed to do. But there was a lot of NIL deals going on before all this was going on. They just weren't legal. No one told nobody. I mean, all that stuff in college. Now, we're part of it, but at the same time, that's where you're at in today's time. At least it makes it out there, and it is legal, and the guys can get compensated. But I think it's enticing in recruiting. I think it's very dangerous in that way. But, I mean, you got to enforce the rules when they're broken. You got to handle that part of it.
So I think the biggest issue that I have with this conversation as it's ongoing is, for the most part, we don't really truly know just exactly what has gone on at Texas A&M from a name, image, likeness standpoint, the money the recruits have gotten to come there. There's plenty of speculation about it. There's plenty of denial, and some of that's related to the way in which NIL laws are worded in states like Texas, where it's not supposed to be a pay-for-play situation. It's not supposed to be, as Jimbo said, an enticement to come to the school. For the most part, those laws won't really be enforced because not every state has the same law, and the NCAA, for the most part, has shown no willingness whatsoever to have any kind of enforcement mechanism in place for name, image, or likeness as it exists because it simply doesn't have the political power to do so anymore. So I think the biggest issue is knowing who's right and who's wrong. Folks like Lane Kiffin of accusing Texas A&M of leveraging money and maybe even money alone to put together the number one class. Jimbo Fisher's boss, Ross Bjork, the Texas A&M athletic director, who says we were recruiting well before name, image, likeness. That alone doesn't explain what's happening here. I believe it's hard to know which side is more right than the other, which argument is more believable than the other, because as it stands right now, we don't have a lot of tangible facts about exactly what A&M recruits have gotten in exchange for coming to College Station to play college football. But no doubt this is a very hot topic, and no doubt there are a lot of folks who look pretty skeptically upon A&M putting together the greatest class in the history of recruiting, at least based on the recruiting services, because of the role that cash payments or financial incentives might have played in helping A&M get to that point. We'll talk more about what A&M's done today and kind of where that class ranks in a moment. Before that, though, I do want to give you a chance to sound off comments. We'll go Facebook first, YouTube after that, and you can weigh in on this topic today. Nick Saban, very pointed remarks against the way in which NIL is currently being used. Lane Kiffin, Saban's former lieutenant, saying some of the same things. Let's find out what you have to think about all of that. Scott Mitchell says, hats off to Jimbo Fisher and his staff. It had to be hard on their backs, taking all that money from oil companies and carrying it to the bank. So, Scott, pretty funny comment there. Maybe going a little bit different direction than you might would have thought. Guy Cody Caldwell weighs in on Facebook to say what's going to happen is as a freshman, they're going to go get paid and then transfer to where they can play more to get the NFL. My point, Coach Prime and Barstool buying the number one recruit. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, Deion Sanders has also denied the fact that Travis Hunter came to Jackson State because of any kind of NIL money. I guess Barstool's denied that too, although Barstool said less about it than Deion has. And once again, maybe part of the reason why Deion denied the NIL deal for Travis Hunter when Hunter chose Jackson State over Florida State is because Hunter, I guess, as a resident of the state of Georgia, would maybe be under the auspices of the Georgia NIL law, which also states that NIL has to be about true payment for marketing services and not just a pay-for-play situation. Once again, these laws are written, but no one seems all that intent on enforcing them necessarily, but that might be why Deion denied the NIL relationship with Travis Hunter and why A&M has also denied some of the things related to their players there as well. And as far as what this would mean for a player that doesn't stay in the program, there's been plenty of open speculation about that there too. Philip Elder says, poor Jeremy Bloom. That was the former skiing athlete at Colorado, and Reggie Bush, obviously you remember him from USC with his Heisman Trophy taken away. He says those players were kind of ahead of their time, and in some respects that seems to be true. Mike Cleveland says, so people are mad because they didn't take advantage of NIL to the same extent. Alabama, Texas, and Oklahoma have done the same thing under the cover for years. He says, get a life about that to anybody complaining about this. And maybe it's just as simple as that the rule has been in place in the past because of the belief that college athletics was some form of amateurism. Now, listen, I'm actually a pretty old school traditional guy on this. I really am. I think that the college system works better than some people say that it does. There are some people who want to just blow up the whole system. They're almost anarchists when it comes to college football, and I'm not really one of those guys. For the most part, I believe the college system actually serves those who are in the system pretty well. There are plenty of people who will tell you that, like the coaches and the high salaries, it's like some sort of tyrannical hierarchy. I simply don't believe that to be true. I think the amateur college system actually works really well. And I've told you before, the more it migrates to being like another minor league sport, feeder system for the league above it, I think college football's popularity is actually threatened because of that. However, I think that Mike's comment here is still worth fully considering because there are plenty of people who will tell you that the pretend attempt to appear amateur in the past was all a sham because of all the money that's existed in college athletics and the suggestions of improper benefits for players going back forever, including Eric Dickerson saying that back when he was a college recruit that A&M offered him a Trans Am back in the early 1980s. So a lot of this stuff's been around for a long time, and I think Mike's comments at least worth considering here that, hey, the notion that these were players attending a school simply for the degree as it was, maybe that's a sham, or the idea that these weren't already giant businesses that simply had a loose connection to the school, maybe that's a sham too. I mean, I don't find myself quite so cynical about life, but admittedly, there is some credence to some of those arguments, and that's why these comments will carry a lot of weight. Cliff McMurray says the common denominator in all of this is NIL, is that they're students first. He says they must go to class, they make their grades. If they don't, they should have their scholarship given back. And boy, it does really seem like, and once again, I'm not Pollyannish about the role that academics has played in any of this either, but man, it does really seem like we're getting farther and farther away from that too, which, I mean, remember the commercial that always shows in the NCAA tournament, the basketball tournament, of most of the folks who play college sports will go pro in something other than athletics? And that is still true. That if you ask any college football player, are you going to play in the NFL? Like 90% of them will say, yes, I'm going to, but actually only about 1 in 10,000 do. And that's a real big issue that by fixating on NIL stuff, by fixating on some of the things that you can do to make yourself more attractive to the NIL type clients, that you're actually getting away from what college is kind of supposed to be, which is preparing you for the next phase of your life and using your experience in college athletics to make you more successful in what you do next. That later in this case really is longer. That it may seem wise now to take advantage of a short-term opportunity to cash in now, but the relatively small amount of money that you make from NIL money, and for most of these athletes, it is a relatively small figure of money. The relatively small amount of money that you have a chance to make on this pales in comparison to what you have a chance. If you're an NFL player, certainly what you would make in that league, but even other professions as well. Like, I was thinking about this. Let me do like 5 seconds worth of soapbox, and then I'll get back to your comments, because I am really interested in what folks have to say about this. So I live here in Georgia. High school football coaches in Georgia are paid very well. It is very common for a high school football coach in Georgia to make at least $100,000 per year. So if we assume 20 years worth of being a head coach in a state like Georgia, that's about $2 million of lifetime income for being a high school football coach. And almost no one at the college level will have any kind of NIL money that comes close to rivaling that. Now, you can say, well, you can get both. You can get the future income and the current income, and maybe you can. But if I had a son who was a college football player and was in consideration of this, I mean, my thought to him would be, hey, pay a lot more attention to your long-term earning potential than you do your short-term earning potential. That if you've got a chance to play in the NFL, hey, that's more money than what this NIL is going to offer you. And if you don't really feel like you're cut out for the NFL, and by the way, you'll know pretty quick if you're NFL material or not. If you don't really feel like that's the direction your life's going to go, then think about how you can make money in football beyond just, grabbing a few $1,000s now for some TikTok post. And doing the hard work necessary to set yourself up for long-term success. I still think that's a wiser use of your time, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Ronnie Vine says it's not a small amount of money. But Ronnie, of what we know for sure in comparison to the kinds of money players are getting in the NFL, what we can say tangibly for sure, it is a small amount of money. For instance, the Miami booster the other day that came out about the money that he's willing to pay Miami players. We're talking about $30,000 and $40,000. Now, to you and me, that's probably a pretty large figure. But to someone who's going to play in the NFL, that is a much smaller figure by comparison. That the average college football player is not making NFL money for playing in college. Now, maybe quarterback here is, quarterback somewhere is, but that's still the outlier in all of this. For instance, there was a little bit of attention given to the fact that Spencer Rattler last season at Oklahoma got 2 cars. But knowing a little bit about how this kind of stuff works because of the business that I'm in, he's not given those cars as a gift. In other words, that's a combined value of nearly, $200,000, $150,000, $200,000 if you're talking about 2 really nice cars. But that's not what he's given. He's not given the cars. He's given a chance to drive the cars, like a lease type situation. So instead of being a net worth addition of $150,000, it's actually a revenue payment of about $20,000, and he has to still pay taxes on that. That even for like the sexiest sounding NIL deals of them all, it's still a smaller amount of cash value than some people assume that it could be. Okay, so this is Jimbo Fisher from Right Now. He says, this is Chris Hummer, reporter for 24/7 Sports, saying, the Jimbo Fisher talking NIL, he says, it didn't affect recruiting at all. This $30 million thing is a joke. This idea, there's some fund out there, and it was written, this is really funny. He says it was written on Bro Bible, which it was, by a guy named Slice Brad. Now all of a sudden the country believes it. we talked about this last week, that the origin story for the $30 million rumor related to Texas A&M really did come from Bro Bible. That's like the silliest, craziest thing ever. And there are people that would think of themselves as serious people that kind of took that serious. And now on the other side of that, because of the way in which name, image, likeness laws are written, that there would be a motivation for someone like Jimbo to deny that. And, we talked about Ross Bjork's denial to the Houston Chronicle on this too. But I am generally more likely to believe the essence of what Jimbo is saying there is true. That the weird message board post that got picked up by Bro Bible and had, folks talking everywhere, that does have a little bit more of the ring of being message board rumor than it does of being actual fact. I guess I'm probably somewhat more aligned with Jimbo on that. All right, a few more comments and we'll move on and do some other stories. Lucy Bowers-Boykin checks in to say, I don't have a problem with NIL. I just think it needs to be regulated with consistency across the board. And this is where college athletics clearly dropped the ball. And it may lead to the dissolving of the NCAA because of it. The NCAA got trounced in the Supreme Court and lost its will, lost its nerve to have any kind of regulation over any of this kind of stuff moving forward. And all of a sudden, you got a situation where some states, like Florida, for instance, in our SEC footprint, was racing way out in front to get their NIL law in place so that Florida athletes, not just University of Florida, but athletes in the state of Florida would have a chance to cash in on that. And then once the NCAA stepped back on this, all of a sudden it almost became a situation where if you were in a state that did not have a written on the books NIL law, you may have actually been at a little bit of an advantage. The Travis Hunter thing's an example of this. After Hunter left, chose Jackson State over Florida State, there were actually some legislators in Florida that began, I don't really know where this process stands now because a lot of this stuff's hard to follow, but a lot of the some of the legislators in Florida actually started trying to change their state law so that it would open the door for more straight pay for play. That actually a lot of the states who thought they were helping their schools by getting an NIL law on the books actually came up with something that ended up being more restrictive for some of those schools than some of the states that have no law in place at all. But for the most part, NIL is kind of now widely accepted by the NCAA. That's part of what makes some of this a bit complicated. All right, a couple more comments. Yeah, Oren Chile weighs on the same thing I was just saying, that the problem is the laws vary from state to state. Another gift from the state of California. Yeah, and as I said before, there are some states that don't have a explicitly written NIL law at all, but that doesn't prohibit athletes in those states from taking advantage of NIL opportunities, because the biggest issue here is once the NCAA, boy, a lot of acronyms, but once the NCAA got beaten in court, all of a sudden they just kind of stepped down on all this, and they're just simply not enforcing NIL right now. Kevin Cook says the NCAA is a joke now, at least in terms of it is essentially powerless. I mean, that, we've just kind of arrived at that moment where the NCAA just has very little power on this anymore. Philip Elder says NIL gives advantage to cities like Tuscaloosa, Lexington, Columbia, Durham, or Spokane, and the subject schools than it does Chicago, LA, Miami, New York City, because those athletes are big fish in a smaller pond, celebrity-wise. That's true, but also, for the most part, the kinds of businesses that function in Tuscaloosa and places like that are just smaller than they would be otherwise in the big cities. And, there's almost like a Goldilocks zone of which companies could actually best be suited to pay players. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Like, let's say I'm BA's sandwich shop. Like, I got a sandwich shop. I'm a big fan of Georgia, and I'm going to try to give an NIL deal to a Georgia player because I love the Georgia program that much. I want one of their players to endorse my business. It's BA sandwich shop. I'm making the sandwiches. I'm doing that kind of stuff. The problem is the margin for a sandwich shop is just not very high. There are some successful ones, but for the most part, even a successful sandwich shop type restaurant is not dealing with very high profit margins. So there's a very good chance that I don't have a ton of money to pay the player that I'd like to be able to pay. I can give him a little bit, but I can't give him, a high 5-figure sum. I just can't afford to do that. So therefore, I'm not really perfect for this. Now, let's say, a lot of Auburn fans look at their guy. They say, we got Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, is an Auburn guy. We're going to start paying all these athletes in Auburn, all these Auburn athletes in Apple money. Well, the problem with that is that once you get to a big enough company, now you're publicly traded. And all of a sudden now it doesn't matter what Tim Cook wants to do. Apple has a responsibility to its shareholders, the same way that, like in Atlanta, Coca-Cola has a responsibility to its shareholders, and all these other big giant corporations that when you get big enough, you've got plenty of money, but you don't have the freedom to just go throwing money around whichever way that you want to. So I don't think you're going to see as much of that either. Now, if you're let's say you're a very high net worth, deca millionaire, 9-figure type net worth type person, you can throw around whatever money you want to, but for the most part, you're talking about people paying out of their personal holdings. And listen, I don't care how rich you are, that money goes away after a while. That if you're not paying out of a business, you're paying out of your own bank account, like that doesn't just last forever. I mean, eventually you've paid all you can afford to pay. I don't care how rich you are. So that's the trick with all of this too, is that there's a certain company size-wise, privately held wise, there's a certain company and a certain kind of net worth here that probably sets up better for paying NIL than others do. Good comments. We'll keep these going here for a little bit longer. Scott Mitchell, this is an interesting comment. He says, I'm not against players getting paid. They truly deserve it, but something is wrong. Okay, so this ties back into, and I can't remember if we talked about this. On this show or not. But Dennis Dodd, CBS Sports, the other day brought up the idea that name, image, likeness may just be the first part of this, that we're talking NIL right now, but eventually we may be talking about some sort of payment to players coming from the real big pot of money that exists from the television revenue. That's the big money that comes in here. And eventually will we see money coming to players from all of that. Now, the problem with that is that now you got to start talking about Title IX, things like that, which is not really relevant in the NIL discussion, but would be more relevant if you're talking about that world where now everybody's going to get the same thing, and all of a sudden now you're not making merit-based payments for true worth. You're making across-the-board payments to everybody, which is going to be hard to get everyone to agree with what that number's supposed to be, but that's out there as well. Final thought from me, and then I'll take a few comments on YouTube. One of the biggest issues, to go back to what the commenter said about something not feeling right, one of the biggest issues I believe that exists with this is the influence we are allowing figures that aren't as well vetted as the coaches to have sway over the players. I think that's a potential problem. It's one of the reasons why coaches for a long time haven't wanted player agents crawling around practice and all the things, related to that they're trying to, you go to a high school football game now. The sidelines for high school football games have gotten far more restrictive than they used to be, especially at the big programs, the place where a lot of college prospects play, because, you want to control who's speaking to players on the sidelines, and anybody and everybody may try to get on these sidelines and get so-and-so player's attention as a way of trying to get into his life at some point in time. And that's the problem I have and I'm concerned with name, image, likeness. Not everyone who relates to a player, through the NIL opportunities is some sort of scoundrel that can't be trusted, but some of them are. And I just simply, blanket statement here, broadly speaking intentionally, I just simply trust the advice a coach gives a player more than I trust the advice that some sort of agent for a marketing company gives a player. I just do, because if the coach gives bad advice, there is going to be a negative repercussion against the coach. People will remember, and that'll be used against him in the future when he's going after other recruits. But the marketing agents for these licensing companies or whatever we're talking about here, you're talking about folks who are just nowhere near as famous. And the advice they're giving to these players is nowhere near as well vetted. And it's those additional voices into the sport, into the minds of the players, that I potentially think could be a pretty big problem. Dallas Short says, who's checking in from Southern California, he says, the holdup in getting Caleb Williams announced was finalizing his NIL deals. He says $400,000 in total. So maybe we'll read some more about that. B.A. We've got a YouTube commenter whose username is now BA Sandwich Shop. That's really funny. Really funny. G. Greg's Bama Boy and Dallas Shorts kind of weighing in here on the Caleb Williams thing. Yeah, pretty big deal there. Pretty big deal. People on YouTube over here just throwing out all kinds of accusations about things that have gone on in the past. I can't do that, y'all. Y'all know I can't read that. But nonetheless, Rustin Robinson says money equals politics. And yeah, I guess maybe that's the case here. Certainly very interesting. Certainly very interesting how all this is playing out. By the way, you see Shamar Stewart there. Okay, so this is also related to NIL stuff. Because that's the rumor. Shamar Stewart out of the state of Florida choosing Texas A&M says, if my decision was just based off money, I would have just stayed in my hometown. I'm doing what I think is my best interest. It's either you're with me or you're against me, Shamar Stewart says, also denying that he's leaving Miami, South Florida, to go to Texas A&M on the basis of money. So kind of an interesting denial there. All right, a couple more comments, and we'll get through, and I'll do more with you on the A&M thing here in a moment. But that's a very interesting quote coming in from Shamar Stewart. Oren Chile says, when it comes to NIL, they're going to have to stop it, study it, and restart it with a total do-over. I wonder if you can put the toothpaste back in the tube. Brian Burnett says, okay, you've likely touched on this, BA, but just pay the kids. Give them some pocket money. Colleges use their athletes' labor to make billions per year in revenue. Put some parameters around it. If you make the team, you make whatever amount the league decides. He says rich leagues can pay more than poor leagues do. And maybe ultimately that's where all of this is heading, paying some money out of the revenue pile that comes in. But and I don't want to get too complicated with all this because eventually you're getting above my head. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. But eventually here's the problem with that there is no free lunch to taking the situation you just described and turning the players into employees. Like, maybe that is better. Hey, maybe the money trade-off on that is better. But I don't know that it's better for everybody. As Pat Narduzzi said, the Pitt coach the other day, that once you're an employee, you can be fired. And listen, I talk to a lot of young athletes who want to play at the college level, and I certainly talk to a lot of their parents. And one of the things that I hear a lot is, probably the common thing that I hear over and over again is, most players are not really that concerned with NIL. Yeah, if you're Caleb Williams, I guess you are, but most players aren't Caleb Williams. Most players are concerned about this. The scholarship that's been promised to them, will it still exist? And once I get on campus, are they willing to allow me to stay there? The thing that players and their families, I believe, are most concerned about is the scholarship at some point in time being yanked from them. The school that gives the offer, can I trust you to follow through on this offer? And once I'm there, can I trust you to give me a home? And what Narduzzi said, and he's not the only coach who feels this way, is that once you're an employee getting money out of the TV revenue or whatever else to play the sport, now you're in, like any other employee in a state like Georgia where I live and most of the SEC states there as well, you can be fired for any reason at any time. You just can. That's just the law. And boy, you talk about a hard life. I mean, that could certainly be a very different version of that. And then at that point in time, the relatively meager financial payment, once it's spread out amongst all Division I athletes equally, the relatively meager financial payment in comparison for the harsh reality of how certain employees get treated in certain situations, I actually don't know if that works out as well as some people might think that it does. And what's funny is, and some of you know this because you're younger, like some of you are either still in college now or just out of college. For a lot of these Division I athletes, prior to name, image, likeness, they were already getting the Pell Grant. I mean, and that's 5-figure money or something like that. I mean, I will be very candid for 1 second. Like a lot of times, if you go across SEC country, you see football player that you know driving very nice car. And in some respects, you're like, look at so-and-so program gave so-and-so player this very nice car. And who knows? Over the course of time, maybe that's happened. But in some cases, what you find out is that the player already had all his clothes paid for, all his food paid for, all his, housing paid for, that everything the player needs, he's got paid for. He's got some extra spending money because of the Pell Grant or whatever else, that his parents are like, we want to do something for you. So a lot of times when you see certain player driving certain car, it ends up being because the parents bought the car for it because they didn't have anything else to do with their money. They weren't feeding him. They weren't clothing him. They weren't housing him. All of a sudden now it's like, well, I guess we'll just buy you this car because we're not really spending any other kind of money on you whatsoever. That oftentimes in the past, that's kind of what's ended up being true. Maybe not all the time. I'm not going to be a Pollyannish, but in some respects, that's kind of the way that things have worked out. All right, let's get ready to move on. We'll come back to more comments here in a moment. Oren Chile brings up an interesting point that it's funny that you don't hear that much about it in basketball, or will you? Well, you heard about it a lot a couple of years ago because remember the NCAA, not the NCAA, the FBI. The FBI investigated this. You had guys like Will Wade who were caught on recording talking about, the kinds of payments they were giving to players. And for the most part, all of that has just kind of gone away. And I've watched a lot of the documentaries and things like that. I still don't understand why the FBI cares about this. I still don't understand that. But there was a big hullabaloo about improper payments in the basketball world a couple of years ago. But for the most part, that's just kind of gone away. That folks acted like they sort of knew that. I think for the most part, people kind of did. And it's just not really that scandalous anymore. And I still can't quite figure out why the FBI cared so much about that. Maybe in one sentence you could explain that to me. But all of the basketball stuff related to this has kind of already happened 3-4 years ago, it seems like by now. All right, speaking of Texas A&M, let's move on here in SEC Country Live. Actually, before I do that, let me do this. Shout out to my friends at Meriwether and Tharp. Obviously, a lot of college football arguments, going on around here, but sometimes around your home, maybe the arguments are of a more intense variety, and they're a reminder to you of a relationship that's become severed. And I don't joke about that. That is a serious thing. And if you find yourself here as in the early stages of 2022, realizing that this is the year you need to take the next step towards a marriage that's just come to an end, well, that's where Meriwether and Tharp can step in. They're your source for divorce around SEC country based in Atlanta, but of service to you wherever you are, explaining the law, how it works for you, how it can be to your advantage to know certain things that impacts your finances, relationship with children, everything associated with that. That is what Meriwether and Tharp can do. So no matter where you are around SEC country, check out this website, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. And get in touch with Meriwether and Tharp on that. All right, so Shamar Stewart, you saw him on the screen a moment ago talking about going to A&M for reasons, he says, that had very little to do with name, image, and likeness. We have no choice but to take him at his word on that. But nonetheless, the addition of Stewart now cements A&M as the number one class of all time. Yeah, there's the Stewart announcement from a moment ago, and Saturday Down South put this out. So leave this on the screen for a second if you don't mind. So A&M, the 2022 class, goes ahead of Alabama's class from a year ago, Florida's class from 2010, the fourth highest rated class of all time, Bama from 2017, and then Georgia from 2018. So a couple of things that jump out here. Obviously, the Alabama class is successful. We don't quite yet know how the 2021 class is going to work out, but the 2017 class at least led to a national championship in those players' senior years back in 2020. But it is worth pointing out, and if you're an A&M fan, maybe be careful here, that the elite class that Florida put together in 2010, what did they get to show for that? It got Will Muschamp a pink slip, did it not? Because he came in on the heels of all of that in the post-Urban Meyer world. Meyer retired, or, stepped away, I guess is better said. Will Muschamp didn't win anything. So I'm not quite so sure being on a list with 2010 Florida makes you feel all that great. And to be honest with you, the 2018 Georgia class, the first number one class under Kirby Smart, yes, the senior year for many of those players results in a national championship this year, but a lot of the five-star names, Justin Fields, Brenton Cox, Cade Mays, a lot of those guys didn't stick around Athens very long. So once again, be careful if you're Texas A&M that your 2022 class is actually on a board there with a couple of classes I'm not quite so sure are necessarily what you want your end result to ultimately be, but nonetheless, pretty interesting stuff there. But I think the other thing that comes on all of this is, and listen, we've had this argument on this show now for going on a year. I am a believer that Jimbo Fisher is a good coach. When somebody like Jimbo or his boss, Ross Bjork, or anybody else, when they say that A&M was recruiting well before all of this, for the most part, that's just factually true. So generally speaking, I think that Jimbo is building something pretty impressive there at A&M. Eventually, I do think it may prove to be the number one threat to Alabama's dominance in that half of the league. However, at a certain point in time, the clock is kind of ticking. this was a big step back for A&M on the field this season compared to the top 5 team it put together in 2020 in a pandemic year where it won a lot of close games. And suddenly those close results not exactly working out in A&M's favor this past season. That I do think that the byproduct of this kind of recruiting class is even greater expectation for success on the field. Because here's what I'm going to tell you. If it is true that in some form, some of these recruits that arrive at Texas A&M did so because of big payments from big, you sort of picture the oil man with the big belt buckle that's the size of the Intercontinental title or something like that. Like, those guys are not going to keep paying money forever if A&M's not winning games. They're just not getting the ego boost from that they want. If it's indeed happening, it's not going to last forever if A&M's not winning games. So while it's obviously better to have the players than not, you want the talent level in your program. That's clearly true. I do think it raises the pressure on Jimbo to start doing something with these guys right now. And a lot of that for him is on the offensive side of the ball. For as much as he's established his reputation as a tutor of quarterbacks, had a long list of first-round type guys when he was at Florida State, and before that as offensive coordinator at LSU, that has not worked out so well at Texas A&M thus far. Hayes King, maybe he would have been that guy had he not gotten hurt. Now you bring in Max Johnson as a transfer. You can decide what you think about him based on what you saw at LSU. But one way or another, there is now pressure on Jimbo to actually win some games, and to do so on the offensive side of the ball. They've ran the ball well. They've had a good offensive line. They've had a great defense, formerly led by Mike Elko. But can they get the passing game going? Honestly, that's what a lot of the attention is going to be paid on as A&M takes these recruits and tries to turn them into players there for that program. Let me move on and talk about something else here on SEC Country Live. It's gotten a lot of attention a little earlier in the week. We addressed this some last week, and the issue is even greater now than it was then because Auburn has lost another coordinator. Now, we talked last week on the show about Derek Mason at the time reportedly on his way to Oklahoma State. That finally eventually became official, and it has been reported, Brandon Marcello from 24/7 Sports had this, that it was I guess you'll call it a personality clash. That wasn't quite the word that Marcello used, but I'm paraphrasing here, maybe a disagreement about certain things, a difference in personalities maybe, that led Mason to no longer be at Auburn, now in Stillwater. We told you last week that under normal circumstances, a coordinator would not leave a place like Auburn to go to a place like Oklahoma State. That's not a lateral move, that's a step down, given the stature of the two programs. But when Mason makes that choice, you're led to believe he wanted to get away from Harsin, as other coaches have seemingly wanted to do as well. We don't quite fully know what led to the next coordinator departure, but boy, it certainly goes as a part of the story because Austin Davis, who was the offensive coordinator, hired to replace Mike Bobo, who Brian Harsin moved on from at the beginning of the offseason. All of a sudden now, Austin Davis is not sticking around either. Now, I'll show you the statement from Davis where he cites some personal reasons here. Let me, in fact, just read this to you. Jay Tate, reporter on the Auburn Beat, shares it. My decision to resign is 100% based on personal reasons. After more than a decade in the NFL, with a daily grinds player and coach, I've realized how much I miss my family. My desire to spend more time with them. While I need to step away from coaching, I can't say enough, but the first-class way I was welcome to the Auburn family, and the way this football program is run with a championship mindset and a focus on developing these young men into winners on and off the field. Now, the cynical part of me says this and is forced to admit, almost no instance I can think of when a coach said he was resigning to spend more time with his family did he actually end up spending more time with his family. It just doesn't seem like that happens very much. But if Davis says, hey, this is all personal related for me, we almost have no choice but to at least take him at his word on that. But this still doesn't make Auburn look very good. It also doesn't make Davis look very good. But frankly, Auburn fans care about their own program. And right now, it's hard to describe this Brian Harsin era as anything other than simply a failure to launch. They have just had a hard time establishing any permanent roots whatsoever. There have been 8 gazillion players into the transfer portal. A huge portion of those congregate along the defensive line, maybe the most important position group other than quarterback in the entire league because of the athletic nature of the league. They've lost defensive linemen left and right. They've lost now, 5 coordinators, complete changeover on both sides of the ball now more than one time. What an unbelievable mess that Brian Harsin has there at Auburn. And Harsin better be very happy that Bruce Pearl's number 1 in basketball because a lot of the attention being paid to what's happening at Auburn seems to be obscured by the fact the basketball team is winning games. And listen, Everybody loves a winner, and any SEC fan base would probably rally around their basketball team if they were truly number one, and Bruce Pearl's team is playing really well. It's a fun team to watch, no denying that. But boy, oh boy, at some point in time, the nets get cut down and the season comes to an end, and the Auburn fans who've grown disgruntled and kind of restless and just frankly have seen a malaise set in, they're going to turn their attention back to football for a moment. And Brian Harsin is going to really hear it if there is not more firm footing established for this program there at a certain point. It's easy to forget. As recently as 5 years ago, Auburn was winning the SEC West and was a real, legitimate playoff contender. Man, that seems like a long time ago right now. Other story to get to here for a moment. We had Dallas Schwartz in our comment section a moment ago mentioning the situation with Caleb Williams there at USC, and it kind of got me thinking. You know, the two schools that have battled over the course of time for the moniker of USC, the traditional version of that, Southern Cal, out west, and here in the SEC, the University of South Carolina. And kind of interesting to think that both of our USCs here in college football both have quarterbacks that used to be at the University of Oklahoma. And maybe this was a coincidence, maybe not, but on the same day that Caleb Williams was making it official to USC, the other former Oklahoma quarterback, Spencer Rattler, now at the University of South Carolina, was also making some activity on social media himself. Let me show you this on the screen here for a moment. You see Spencer Rattler on the left side and Caleb Williams on the right side there. Spencer Rattler letting you know that in Columbia for that USC, he's going to be wearing number 7. And Caleb Williams now at the other USC there in Los Angeles. Here's the thing that I think I'm prepared to say. Although the arrival of Williams to Los Angeles is going to get way more fanfare than the arrival of Rattler to South Carolina, Williams just seems to be a better prospect right now. Easy to forget at one point in time, Rattler was kind of an odds-on favorite with the Heisman Trophy, but as of late, it seems like Williams has kind of become the better prospect. Despite that being true, I'm going to take Spencer Rattler at South Carolina to have a better season in 2022 for his USC than Caleb Williams is going to have for his version of USC out west. I feel this way for a couple of ways. First of all, Rattler stepping into by far the better team. South Carolina was a winning team a year ago, getting 7 wins, and the first year for Shane Beamer, that's a schedule that includes, the entirety of the SEC gauntlet plus Clemson as an in-state rival. They didn't beat Clemson, but nonetheless, it speaks to the schedule that South Carolina was forced to play. Finding 7 wins on that's a real testament to what Beamer did in year one. By comparison, USC was a losing team in 2021, and I don't see how much Caleb Williams is going to really be able to do to change that. He may bring more wins, but he doesn't make them a playoff contender, and frankly, I'd be surprised if USC is a better team than South Carolina next year. That's part of the reason for that. Also, when you look at some of the stuff with Caleb Williams near the end of last season, what you see is a quarterback that once he took over for Spencer Rattler didn't exactly play as dynamically throughout much of the rest of the season as he did during the game against Texas. Folks remember that, the decision by Lincoln Riley to move away from Rattler towards Caleb Williams. But I'm not quite so sure how much folks really paid attention to what happened on November 13th when Williams against Baylor only completed 50% of his passes, had 2 interceptions, no touchdowns. In a win against Iowa State on November the 20th, only completed 44.4% of his passes, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Only completed 50% of his passes in the regular season finale win against Oklahoma State. Did throw 3 touchdowns that day, but still not a very high completion percentage. Bowl win against Oregon, played well that day, 242 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks. But a lot of the games down the stretch last year, Caleb Williams did not exactly light the world on fire for the Sooners. So hear me now, believe me later, but remember that I said it. Which USC has the better quarterback? In 2022, I'll take Spencer Rattler at South Carolina over Caleb Williams at USC. Getting towards the Super Bowl, you hear, all kinds of bold picks and predictions. You just heard one from me there. Well, as you get ready for the Super Bowl, time to get some action down with our friends at BetUS. Go to BetUS.com, use the promo code SCC125, and take advantage of a big initial deposit bonus opportunity, about 125%. That means you put in money, BetUS is going to put more money in than you do, literally 125% of what you put in there. But you've got to use the promo code SCC125 at BetUS.com to take advantage of that great offer. Of course, BetUS, America's most beloved sports book, been that way for more than 25 years. The way you get to be that way is by taking really good care of your players, and that is exactly what BetUS been doing for a long, long time. So BetUS.com, promo code SEC125, and take advantage of the 125% sign-up bonus today. So good stuff there. We'll have more on that as we head towards the Super Bowl next week. How about this here for a moment? So Danny Lewis is a tight end out of the state of Louisiana, and he was also the subject of the now infamous, I guess this is the second infamous, Brian Kelly dance video. Well, so I'll show you this from our friends at Pro Football Focus who put this out there. The Danny Lewis dance video where, and you have these, basically those not turnstile thing. They're almost like, I don't know what you call them, these like spinning tables they stand on for these social media shoots, and they're small. So you got Brian Kelly, man, he is in his personal space. That's all I can tell you. This video has been viewed millions of times now. He's in his space. He's just kind of right there up on him. I don't know about that. Nonetheless, that's Danny Lewis. And so you may be interested to know this video now comes to a close with Lewis actually choosing Alabama today over LSU. So whatever dance moves Brian Kelly tried to put out there, and it's almost like I'm reminded of, y'all remember the Suge Knight thing where he's talking about, I guess he was Sean Combs at the time, about how he's, the producer's trying to be all up in the video or whatever else. Like I get a little bit of Suge Knight, Puff Daddy thing from Brian Kelly, always trying to be all up in the videos or whatever else. But nonetheless, it actually doesn't work out for him all that well because Lewis chooses Alabama today instead of LSU. So for the second time this offseason, Brian Kelly's gone viral for a dancing video, but this one did not result in a commitment or a signing. We just wanted to make you aware of that here on SEC Country Live. All right, so we love to close out our show on kind of a happy note. We'll do that in a moment. Let me do a few more comments before we get to our SEC LOL. Just a couple more comments because I have not checked in a few minutes. So let me do a few more of those, and then we'll do something kind of fun to finish off the show here coming up in just a moment. Back on YouTube. We'll get a few comments over there. Oh, Lord. Sorry, y'all. That is quite a level of spam that just got popped in there. Apologize for that. So Darian Ford checks in to say Auburn's literally burning itself to the ground right now. Yeah, it's a real mess. It's a real mess what's going on there. No question about that. He says getting the resume for the Auburn head coaching job coming soon. He says, but he thinks that Auburn's going to rise to the top again before Texas A&M does. So there's still a lot of skepticism out there about A&M on the field. A lot of folks forced to reckon with the Aggies on the recruiting trail, but still some doubts exist about what A&M does on the field. So pretty interesting. Michael Lindsay says, we were talking about Caleb Williams a moment ago. He says, speaking of the Pac-12, they had 0 5-stars in the whole conference. He says, shaking my head. That is an amazing stat compared to what SEC programs are doing on a regular basis. Or in Chile also says, Brian Kelly's doing way too much. Chill, bro. Yeah, I'm not quite so sure there's any human alive I'd want dancing to me quite so close. Maybe a few, but it certainly wouldn't be Brian Kelly. I can promise you that. It certainly wouldn't be that. Kyle Cummings says, stop the coaches from running out and make them more loyal. Same regulations you want to put on the NIL, just an opinion. And what Kyle says there, I think, is a pretty fair point in that right now one of my greatest frustrations around the transfer portal and stuff like that is it just seems like there are no rules whatsoever, that players can just enter any time and there's just no restriction on that at all, and no one's enforcing tampering, and all of that just seems to be kind of fine with everybody. Well, there are a lot of folks who say, okay, we're going to put some parameters around players, and at some point in time there may be more in place than exists now. Then what are we going to do with coaches? For instance, former Auburn defensive coordinator Kevin Steele takes the job at Maryland. 5 seconds later is taking the same job at Miami. Jeff Collins did that a couple of years ago. Who else has done that? We've had coaches that have gone to I guess Brian McClendon came to Georgia after just getting hired by Miami, that you've got these coaches that are staying at jobs for 2 weeks and then bouncing to another job, that you got to put more parameters on them. And maybe that should happen. What else? Mark Robbins said Brian Harsin is going to be gone by December 2022. He says his personality is way more abrasive than Saban's. I would say the early evidence suggests that could be very true. I do. The early evidence suggests that could be true. So good comments weighing in here, and good stuff all the way around. Brian Burnett, we mentioned the 2018 Georgia class a moment ago. He says, funny thing about Georgia's class, we lost 5 of 6 5-stars to transfer within like 2 years. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that some of these like dream classes, whether it be Georgia in 2018 or Florida in 2010, sometimes the actual results end up being a little different than you assume they would be. And I think a lot of folks will be looking to see what happens to the A&M class because of that. Guy Cody Caldwell says the reason why the FBI got involved in the basketball thing was because there was money laundering going through a children's hospital. Well, I guess that'll get you. All right, so really interesting conversation all day long. Appreciate you being a part of that. And as we said before, I'd like to close out the show on kind of a lighthearted note. A guy that we featured during our SEC LOL before is Joey Molinari. Or Molinaro, maybe that's how you say it. He's famous for impersonations. The best one he probably does is probably the Chris Collinsworth. This is a pretty good dude when it comes to doing the impersonations. And I guess recently came in contact with Nick Saban. He shared this on social media. We'll share this with you from him of what happened when the guy who's famous for impersonating Nick Saban ran into the guy that he impersonates. This is Joey Molinaro. Take a look at this.
I was nervous. I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of cool people and talk to a lot of cool people, but this is the first time in a while that I had been really starstruck and nervous because Coach Saban was right there. I didn't know how he was going to react. I told the crowd tonight, so I don't know if he's seen it. I'm pretty terrified. Anyways, let's get to it. He walks off stage after it's all done, and I'm standing there waiting. You know, Kirk Herbstreit does a great job. Everybody does a great job. Say, Coach, hey, Joey Molinaro, nice to meet you. He shakes my hand and goes, yeah, well, all right. Walks out.
To social media, he's got some good impersonations of Saban and others. He does a pretty good job with that, and funny to hear him tell the story of meeting Saban and then giving you a little bit of the Saban impersonation there at the end. We appreciate all of you being here for SEC Country Live here today, every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the SEC Country Facebook and SEC Country Live YouTube pages. We're here to talk about all the stuff happening around the league. Hope you had a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you back here again next week at the same time for SEC Country Live.